Hi everyone, and welcome to this video on anxiolytic medications. In this video, we're going to go through the main medications that are used in anxiety states. So a good starting point is to kind of define what anxiety is. Anxiety is where a person perceives a stimulus as threatening, whether it is or whether it isn't. So when we get a stimulus that we see as threatening, this will invoke certain pattern behavior that can induce things like fear, worry, nervousness. It can impact certain neurological systems such as cognition, emotions, behavior, motor responses, visceral responses. Now I thought what I could do is I could create a schematic flow diagram of the neurological pathway that's involved in anxiety, and then I'll put it in the context of a stimulus, a stressful stimulus that you're all aware of, because a lot of you are students, so you will be well aware of the stress, which is exams. So the stressful stimuli comes into our neurological system, into the thalamus. So the stress comes in as the exam, so the impending exam is coming up. Now this stimulus can be both internal and external. An example of external is where your professor tells you in 7 days we have an exam, or you get the timetable, or you get an email, or your fellow student tells you that the exam is in 7 days. So that's an external stimulus, which is a stressful stimulus. Or it might be internal. You may just remember it again, or you may visualize it. So that's internal. In any case, the thalamus in this regard works as a hub or a relay center. It will send it to different parts of the neurological system. One part we'll go to first is the cortex. So when this stimuli is sent to the cortex, it will then come to your conscious realization. So here your cortex will go, exam's coming up, it's 50%, so it's a big exam, it's due in 7 days, this is the subject it's on, okay. From here, the cortex will then, so the cortex kind of puts context into the stimulus. From here, it goes to the higher center, which is the prefrontal cortex. And here, the prefrontal cortex will put even more layering in that particular stimuli. It will say, all right, it's 50%, it's in this subject, but if I fail, this is what will happen. I'll fail the course, I'll fail the program. How much do I know? How much will I need to know in 7 days? It will start to think, is this serious or can I manage it? What kind of behaviors can I do now to help manage the anxiety or that stressor? I will start planning out my timetable over the next 7 days, doing my study scheduling, think about what I need to know, those kinds of things. So this can help mediate the stressful response to some degree, so you have this higher order control. Another area network that's in the higher end is the basal ganglia or the chordae nucleus. What this will do is certain repetitive behaviors that can act as almost like a short circuit. So remove acute anxiety in the short term. So it might do certain repetitive behaviors like, let's just check when the exam is, double check again, double check what's in the exam, double check your notes. I'll read my notes one more time before I go to sleep. I'll just make sure I know that before I'll do this particular activity. So it's very repetitive, but it helps with the acute stressor in this part of the system. But it can also work in a detrimental sense. So this can also work with behaviors like procrastination. It can get you to go on your phone and start scrolling because that actually removes that acute thought of the stress in that moment. It won't help the situation, but in that brief moment, it will help with the acute stress. So also the thalamus can send the information, the stressor, down into the limbic system, which is going to put an emotional tag with that stimulus, such as the amygdala plays a very important role in this particular part of the network. So it will tell your body, how much of an acute stress is this? Is this life-threatening? Is this an emergency? Do I need to get out of the situation right then and there? Oh no, this is 7 days, so I don't have to be acutely vigilant at this point in time. So the amygdala can increase the system, so it can turn up the system or turn down the system, depending on how it emotionally gauges that stressor. It will communicate with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, we know, does certain things like the cortisol stress response, So cortisol is released, that mobilizes energy. It also sensitizes the adrenergic system, so sensitizes your fight and flight system. And the hypothalamus also activates the fight and flight system, which sends a signal, activating signal down to the brainstem, and then the brainstem executes that sympathetic response. So we know that the sympathetic response is going to do heart rate, respiratory rate, blood pressure, your GIT, your skin. It's going to have effects in those systems, the sympathetic response in a stress response. But 7 days out, you may not activate those systems too much. But as we get closer to the exam date, the amygdala might be slightly turning the system up. So we might be getting more cortisol, we might be getting a little bit more of these stress hormones, which can actually go back up into the top system and work beneficially. That could help with our vigilance, our motivation, our task preparation. So it can be useful in the stress or the anxiety state when you are adapting well to it. But if it's becoming maladaptive and you get overstressed, so the amygdala thinks, no, I haven't got this under control, this is more of a threatening type of stimuli, these systems get turned on too much, then some of the outputs of these will start to impact the higher sentence, the cognition and your behaviors. So you won't be able to study well, you'll be clouded, your thinking, your memory will be impacted, you'll start to do more repetitive behaviors that won't be beneficial. And all these kind of responses will become amplified. Heart rate's up, respiratory rate's up, tachycardia, sweaty, maybe diarrhea, not sleeping well. So these can be starting to become problematic. So that is giving you a context that you're familiar with, but if this starts to go awry, we can start to think about the anxiety disorders. Remember, a disorder, a mental health disorder, has to be diagnosable, so it has a set of criteria that can be diagnosed, but it usually impacts the intensity, the duration, and the impact on the individual. So when this whole pathway starts to become maladaptive, holistically, you might think about general anxiety disorders in response to certain things. So you might get phobias, social phobia disorders, or specific phobia disorders. You might get panic attack disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders. So there's a whole array of certain anxiety disorders that may become problematic that we need to start to think about how can we manage these with pharmacological agents. And this is where we're going to look at the neurological pathway that the amygdala plays in keeping the anxiety in check, but when the amygdala is not working so well, and these are the hypotheses of what may lead to an anxiety disorder. The amygdala might become hyperactive, or the neural network that's involved in the amygdala and where it relays to the neurotransmitters may also become dysfunctional. So when we look at the amygdala, this can be some of the neurons that's located there. We know the amygdala, when it thinks about stress, can send signals to other parts of the brain that can turn it up. So excite it. So we do have from the amygdala excitatory neurons, things like glutamate neurons, which then goes to other regions and turns them or makes them more active. But the amygdala has a brake system to dial it down, to decrease it, to turn it off. And that's the inhibitory neurons within the amygdala. One notable one is the neurotransmitter called GABA, or gamma aminobutyric acid. So this is a very important inhibitory neurotransmitter that will help normally to modulate the system and work as a brake to turn anxiety down when it's not needed, as is serotonin. So serotonergic neurons can come into this system and then activate it. So if you activate an inhibitor, the inhibitor then inhibits even more, therefore there's less excitation, therefore hopefully less anxiety. But we know in these disorders we have a problem with this processing, these neurotransmitters, or the amygdala becomes too hyperactive, not enough inhibition. So therefore when we think about the drugs, the two important neurotransmitters that we're going to focus on is GABA and serotonin. And that's going to be these two main categories that we're going to go through now. The first one is the GABA agonists. Most importantly in this category are the benzodiazepines. Now, they get that name because of their chemical structure. Now, the way that the benzodiazepines work is they're going to work in the way that GABA acts on to the excitatory neuron. So normally what we would expect to see with the inhibitory neuron is we have GABA vesicles in the end of the neuron, which is packaged up in the vesicle, and when that is activated, GABA spills across the synapse, and then it will come to the receptor channel in the excitatory neuron. So when GABA comes and binds to these protein channels, it will change the conformation of that channel and it will open it up. As a response, or as a result, it opens the channel for chloride. So chloride, which is outside, it's extracellular, it follows its gradient once the door has opened, and then chloride will go in. Now we know that chloride has a charge that's negative. So if we start to throw lots of negative things into that excitatory neuron, it's going to drop the resting membrane potential. So it's going to start to drop lower, more negative, more negative, more negative, which is what we call hyperpolarization. That then means it makes it harder for this excitatory neuron to go and send excitation through the anxiety system. So that can actually dampen the system. So that's going to be how the benzodiazepines work. They don't bind where GABA works, they actually bind just to the side of where GABA usually binds. But when the benzos bind to it, it actually changes the binding site for GABA, allowing the affinity to be even better. So it sensitizes this system even more. Therefore, the way that the channel opens is more sensitive, more chloride can come at higher frequencies, let's say, not longer durations, just it can be coming more frequently. Therefore, we see more inhibition to that excitatory neuron. Therefore, we're kind of dialing down the system a little bit when we're in anxiety. So the benzodiazepines are useful, or they're categorized in three main ways: short-acting, medium-acting, long-acting. So in the short-acting, example is midazolam. This has a half-life of about 3 hours and a duration of 6 hours. So that's just telling you how long it's going to last and work for. Medium-acting is temazepam. This is about an 8-hour half-life, 12-hour duration. And then diazepam, anywhere from 30 to 48 hours. So it's a much longer acting benzodiazepine. And based on this, it's not how it works at the receptor, it's just the pharmacokinetics of the drug in the system, how quickly it's metabolized and excreted from the body. So the clinical indications for benzodiazepines in the context of anxiety is probably more in terms of acute management of certain symptoms in anxiety, opposed to managing anxiety over longer periods of time, which is probably going to be more for the serotonin medication. In addition to anxiety, benzodiazepines can be also used as a hypnotic to help with sleep induction, can be also used in anti-epileptic or seizure medication. An additional clinical indication for benzodiazepines are as a muscle relaxant. When we think about adverse effects, particularly in their therapeutic range, we see things like sedation, problems with motor control and coordination, but probably the most important effects to be aware of is tolerance and dependence. Tolerance meaning the body starts to get used to it, desensitizes to it, so therefore if you want the same response, the dosage has to increase. Dependence meaning the body physiologically adapts to it, therefore if the drug is removed or stopped abruptly, that the person may have withdrawal symptoms. Another drug that works within GABA are known as the barbiturates. Example is phenobarbital. Now, these drugs aren't really used as any anxiolytics anymore because they have a very narrow therapeutic window, which means where they start to work, so their therapeutic point to their toxic point is very close, so overdose is very common. So they're not used so much for anxiety anymore. They can be used for certain insomnia cases, in cases of electroconvulsive therapy, or an induction agent for general anesthetics. How they work slightly differently to benzodiazepines is that they kind of work at the same point as where GABA binds. So they're more likely to keep the chloride channel open for longer. Therefore, we get more inhibition, and that's where you have the risk of overdose, which can lead to complications like respiratory depression and death. So that's why they're not commonly used anymore as an anxiolytic. Moving across to the serotonin medication, the serotonergic neurons basically modulate the impact of the inhibitor. So they kind of activate it, therefore more activation, more GABA, less excitation. Normally what will happen again, we have the packages of the neurotransmitter at the end of the neuron, this being serotonin. Serotonin is then released across the synapse, binding to the serotonin receptor. And what would then happen is on the side of the neuron is you have a reuptake protein, which we call a SERT protein, serotonin transporter. So serotonin is then taken off the synapse and put back into the neuron, repackaged to be used again. So the thought is, if we have a dysfunction with serotonin or GABA and we want to try to encourage more inhibition, what we can do is try to block that transporter, which is basically a reuptake inhibitor. And this can work both for serotonin and noradrenaline. And this is where you have these class of drugs. So selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which is selectively just impacting serotonin, such as fluoxetine and sertraline. But you can also have a combination of serotonin and noradrenaline, which would then also cause more inhibition through the GABA system, such as venlafaxine. Finally, we have an agonist that's specific to the serotonin receptor. So it's not so much the reuptake inhibitor, it's specifically a serotonin agonist such as buspirone. Before we finish, there are a couple additional agents that can be used as anxiolytic medication, one being calcium channel antagonists. So these medications basically stop the release of the neurotransmitter from the excitatory neuron, so it kind of smoothens off or decreases the excitatory response in the anxiety pathways. These medications aren't first-line medications. They're used in other clinical indications such as neuropathic pain and epilepsy. Examples here would be gabapentin and pregabalin. So these are used in other indications, but they can be used in additional agents with anxiolytics. And then we can also think about beta blockers. So beta blockers such as propranolol. And so what this would be essentially doing is managing those acute symptoms such as what we see with the sympathetic nervous system. So it's not so much modulating the overall anxiety response like the other medication, but kind of impacting or decreasing the sympathetic effect from anxiety. So there we have it. There are a list of anxiolytic medications to be aware of, how they work, some of their side effects, and the mechanism of action. Hopefully that has helped, and good luck with your next exam.